Now, in order to soften the backlash of unpopular decisions, new governments tend to blame their predecessors for the horrible mess in which they find themselves. Well, this government is no different, blaming Labour's so-called crazy spending decisions. It's clear the Con-Lib coalition will have to make some unpleasant calls in the next few weeks in order to tackle the deficit. George Osborne told us this morning he will deliver an emergency budget on the 22nd of June. And he's launched an audit to root out irrational spending. Well, here's Giles with all the details. Giles.
I shall try and give them yes. This morning, our new Chancellor, George Osborne, announced the creation of the new Office for Budget Responsibility, call that OBR, get used to it, to be headed by this man, Alan Budd. Now, the new body has been a long-term Conservative promise, and its main aim will be to hold the government's finances to account by publishing independent forecasts for the economy and public finances at least twice a year, around the time of the budget and the pre-budget report. Now, the office will also declare whether it thinks the government's financial policies will reach its target to reduce the deficit, and it'll publish recommendations on what they need to do. Now, this matters because the previous government were criticised for making its economic forecast far too optimistic. Now, so far, we know the government deficit stands at £163 billion, and the new coalition has promised that they will start to tackle this by finding £6 billion of savings this year. Speaking earlier this morning, Mr Osborne acknowledged his plans could cause him a few problems in the future.
I am the first Chancellor to remove the temptation to fiddle the figures by giving up control of the economic and fiscal forecast. I recognise that this will create a rod for my back down the line and for the backs of future Chancellors. That is the whole point. We need to fix the budget to fit the figures, not fix the figures to fit the budget.
Now, make no mistake, the OBR has got its work cut out. The Chancellor has tasked it to carry out a thorough audit of recent government spending. And when published, it could make rather worrying reading. In an interview with the Financial Times this morning, Mr Osborne claims that after looking at the books, they're already finding all sorts of spending skeletons in the closet. We'll look at that in a moment, but let's speak to Robert Chope from the Institute of Fiscal Studies. Robert, the OBR, I'm sure they're saying it's as big a move as when Labour decided to move interest rates out of the Bank of England. Is it a good idea? What's its purpose? Will it work?
I think it is a good idea. It's addressing the problem that people often suspect that the forecasts in budgets and pre-budget reports, both for the economy and for the public finances, are not entirely a dispassionate professional judgment, but there's an element of politically inspired wishful thinking in there as well. And certainly if you look in particular at the period over Labour's second term, their forecasts for the public finances were repeatedly over-optimistic, and most independent commentators at the time said that was the case. Now, you also had plenty of anecdotal evidence at the same time that people within the Treasury, the officials, were also not entirely convinced by some of those forecasts. Now, it's important to, when people talk about fiddling the figures, up to now, budget and pre-budget report forecasts are the responsibility of the Chancellor. They are ministerial forecasts. They have never pretended to be the forecasts of civil servants. So the idea of the OBR is essentially that you remove any suspicion that there's political wishful thinking there. That does not mean that the forecasts are going to be right.
Oh, that warning aside, what about the skeletons in the closet they've been finding? It's part of the lexicon of every government, isn't it? When they come in, they say, oh, it's a lot worse than we thought. Is it bad? And what have you seen that's raised your eyebrow?
Well, as you say, the opening the books and discovering things are worse than you thought is straight out of the Yes Minister collected scripts. I think there are two issues here that the government has been talking about today. One is the fact that the government has approved, the outgoing government has approved some spending in recent months that the current one will not wish to continue. The interesting issue there is if you look at contracts, for example, that have been signed over the last few months, how easy it is to get out of some of those without having big costs. The other side of the opening the books issue is this question of how big is the hole in the public finances that we need to fill in. And that's the first task that confronts Sir Alan Budd and the OBR, is essentially to look at the forecasts that were in Labour's last budget, to look at the forecasts that I presume Treasury officials have handed the Chancellor and Chief Secretary when they arrived in the building, and to say, is that our best guess as to the size of the hole and therefore the size of the policy measures, the tax increases and spending cuts that are going to be necessary to fill that in. And that's a vital precursor to the budget, which will actually contain some detail at least of what the measures will be.
And we will find out more. Robert Choate of the IFS, thank you very much indeed.